to hear your observations and or any questions you might have. So please don't, I would hope you consider this the end all of what's going on with energy storage, but it is a pretty nascent, I think, industry and project type in our state. And I hope you would also add in your experiences too. So that said, real quick, East Point Energy is now wholly owned by Equinor, a broad international energy company. It was founded though by a number of folks in the Charlottesville area who had done renewable energy development before. We have currently 8 megawatt hours of projects in operation in the state. And there's 2 other projects that we sold to Dominion a couple of years ago that we expect to be operational soon. And then we have a large portfolio across the rest of the United States also that's in development. More importantly, though, and for here in Virginia, this is the number of projects and their locations where we've been able to find them. We do not know of one central location where they're all listed necessarily, but as you can see by this map, there's a number of them in southwest Virginia and central Virginia, a little bit on the eastern shore. But I mean, the interesting thing here you might notice, there's not a lot up in Northern Virginia, you might say, where, of course, we're having a lot more discussions about load demand and peak and transmission issues, et cetera. So, and you'll see here that a lot of them are on the smaller side, almost 12 megawatts or less, lots of 2 megawatts. So more piloting, we're not seeing the 100 megawatt, 150 megawatt, plus projects that are present in other states in the U.S. like Texas or California. Just kind of what we're seeing and understand has been helpful for us so far at kind of, I would say, the state level for infrastructure. We, of course, have the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which has a target for battery energy storage systems of 3.1 gigawatts by 2035, which is helping drive demand for some of these projects from Dominion and APCO. We are seeing now at the local level, or sorry, at the state level also, the SEC is taking on distribution level interconnection reform, which will be helpful to help accelerate, I think, from the developer's perspective, getting these through interconnections and then clarifying those things and reducing costs associated with that. And finally, we do have some state legislation. Some of the more important ones that we found helpful or finding helpful is the permit by rule that simplifies the state level permitting process for these projects that are smaller than 150 megawatts. And then also there's clarity for municipalities and developers, at least an option around revenue sharing that it was paired with a lot of solar development, but basically starts out at $1,400 a megawatt, but that municipalities can basically request to kind of simplify the taxation of these projects. Some of our, you might say, micro level related observations around the state are, we've had some recent permitting success. City of Lynchburg earlier in the year, and we're expecting to see some permits come out of Loudoun County later this year, and not having a lot of issues in that, again, Loudoun area. We have had some problems in other municipalities, though, specifically the city of Chesapeake. In general, our feedback has been positive for sites that are industrial zoned or commercial areas, but lesser extent in residential and agricultural areas that tend to have residences near them. Specifically for residential areas, it's been interesting, even though we have pretty large setbacks, more than 100 to 200 feet, that folks are still pushing back against that a lot. I think there's just not a lot of understanding about these types of projects, and that uncertainty leads into the discretionary permitting process. Out of the state control issues, so we're also still seeing a lot of interconnection queue backlogs with PJM. That is delaying a lot of these projects significantly because they're not necessarily being able to tap into what we call the market revenue in the future. And then we also are seeing some challenges with the procurement. Let's say the batteries have not dropped in cost as much because a lot of the ramp up in EVs and then the need for batteries for them. We're also seeing though is the long lead times for our utility partners and their interconnections that need to be done for equipment like transformers has been delaying the projects also. Utilities are needing 18, 24 months to get the transformers and other equipment in place that are required to interconnect our projects. Just looking ahead, and then a couple things that we think would be helpful. One is continue and to see through the interconnection reform process for the SCC, and that would help remove some friction. Again, that's the time that's taken to study these things and reduce upgrade costs potentially. It would be helpful to have some by right state level guidance that would ensure, let's say, in industrial zone sites or commercial zones areas that all our projects are by right and would kind of reduce the amount of discretionary permitting we might have to do at some localities. And finally, we're seeing a lot of confusion with localities around siting agreements. There's not a lot of knowledge among them around what should go in these, what they should look like, et cetera. And obviously there's differences in different municipalities and they have different needs, but we're seeing that as a problem and some folks going overboard and other folks maybe not asking for enough. So I will stop there for, again, I don't know if other colleagues have some observations they want to add on here or have questions about what I present. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate you keeping it brief and allowing for some discussion time amongst some of the members. We'll open the floor for anybody to ask questions of Chris while he's still with us.
Chris, this is Paul Duncan. Question for you on the friction that you alluded to on the previous slide with the SCC. If you had to prioritize the interconnection reform, what would be the biggest targeted areas from your perspective that you'd want to address?
Let me channel my development engineer here, which I am not. I think there is, in general, unfortunately, maybe a lack of capacity on some of our utilities side of things and getting just responses back in time. So it's more of a, can we accelerate the process of getting the back and forth done? I think we have less concerns about the rules that are being used. I think one other thing that I know that comes to mind around this is how our battery projects get treated when we would be, for example, be charging and discharging. A lot of times they're considering that we'd be charging at peak times also, which would not be the case. We'd actually probably be discharging. So that we should be studied not necessarily at the worst peak times, but that we'd be charging up our projects, but actually, when we most likely be filling the batteries up and thus reducing, not really actually adding pressure onto the grid.
Let me understand that and parrot that back. So on that latter part, you're effectively suggesting the development of ESS charging and discharging schedules. Is that correct?
Correct. That would better reflect how the battery storage systems are actually used versus these theoretical sometimes that one would be charging at peak times.
Your perspective is that through the use of the ESS charging and discharging schedules, then you would be able to better align the sizing of the system with whatever available capacity is available with the host utility.
Correct.
Okay. And is from your perspective, is the existing Virginia interconnection policy specifically to charge or to assume the 24/7 365 with no seasonality, no impact or no allowances? So whatever the worst case study interconnection demand or capacity is what's used for sizing and interconnection. Is that a true statement?
So, yeah, Paul, my understanding is we're usually studying at worst case. Again,
Okay.
365, there's no seasonality, et cetera, 24/7. So I will ask my dev engineer though, to get some more specific into that and get back to you and with the group and confirm.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of things that are involved here, and so the time to study, upgrade costs, et cetera, they're all interrelated. So having, from your perspective, having an input just on what you would see to remove some of that friction would be useful. But there are constraints, obviously, there are regulatory constraints, and then there's just operational procedural constraints. So having a clear view from your perspective would be useful.
Chris, I have a,
Sorry, go ahead.
finish your thought.
Yeah, no, I'll get more specific response back to you on that. My apologies. But in general, I think what you said is, and that's how we understand it also.
Thank you.
Chris, we've heard that the revenue sharing legislation, it's a couple years old now, has been pretty successful with solar development to date. Is the story similar with storage development? Are these localities enjoying that revenue share to the extent that they are with solar projects?
From my understanding at the moment, in all the projects that I listed, we haven't seen any municipality utilize the fixed revenue share yet. For battery energy storage projects. So it is, I think it's nice to have and point out to them. In my meetings, usually we're meeting with Commissioner of Revenues folks, and most of them are still getting their heads around how you would tax these things, even the folks up in Northern Virginia with data centers. And so, them running their numbers, versus us running the numbers and understanding, okay, so which would be the best choice for the municipalities is, yeah, I guess it's still nascent. And I haven't seen a municipality yet really do the hard math on, okay, yeah, we want the $1,400 a megawatt that escalates every 5 years, or we want, we just want to use our M&T tax or our real estate tax, plus whatever the SEC is going to use for their depreciation and schedules for. So yeah, I think what is helpful is that it gives kind of options for folks that if they're confused, they don't want to do the math necessarily, which is kind of complex math, unfortunately. That they can just say, hey, we want to simplify this. We want to know what we're going to get and not have to worry about some kind of rules changing in 5 to 10 years from now. So.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I was just gonna add some context. I have seen a few localities pass a revenue share ordinance specifically for storage. And in some cases, they pass a revenue share ordinance just for storage. I think Accomack County did that. Rockingham County. So it is being done, and there's also localities that have previously passed a revenue share ordinance for solar and storage. They may have only had a solar project to date, so it is being used a little bit in my experience, and there has been projects approved that will ultimately use the revenue share ordinance policy.
Thanks for correcting me, Aaron.
Another question, just in terms of the batteries that you are installing, what if it's being discharged at sort of its full capacity, full rate? What is the discharge time from sort of start of discharge to when the battery is utilized fully?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that, Ms. Bond.
Yeah. How long is the discharge time? If the battery is in is going to be discharging sort of at full capacity to discharge?
Right.
How long does it take to go from fully charged to zero?
Well, I think my understanding of how these things are operated is you have various durations on them and again, based on market conditions and demand, maybe whoever owns them, again, they will be discharged at different rates. You have your peaks, which is again what the megawatt is. And then they might go for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, or 4 hours at those durations. And then we can fill those back up though, also based on, what you're seeing on the grid and what makes sense. So I think there's no one answer there, if I understood your question correctly, but there's a certain amount of flexibility also.
So I guess I'll ask the question a bit differently. So let's say that you've got a project that's attached to a utility scale, large scale solar project. And the idea is that essentially the sun goes down, the solar is no longer generating, but while it did generate, some of that energy or all that energy was stored in those batteries that are nearby. Sun goes down all the way, those batteries are fully charged and they are called upon to discharge at sort of full speed.
Right.
What is the time that those batteries will take at that sort of full speed of discharge to go from fully charged to zero and you're needing to be recharged?
May I add something here? Just not to speak for you, Chris, but it depends on the design of the battery system. So I don't know if the page that listed the Virginia project had durations as well, but a battery could be designed to have a 1 hour duration, 2 hour duration, 4 hour duration, etc. So it just depends on.
Yeah, I was just for like this listed a couple of projects. So I was just-
Yeah,
hoping
I
to
was
just
wondering
get a
if you
gauge
could
on-
go back to that project page, it might have had megawatt hours in addition to megawatts. It did not, okay. Then it's, yeah, can't really know. Do you happen to know if those were 4 hour systems or 1 hour systems?
My understanding, there's a mix. You have 1 hour to 4 hour systems, for example. So, yeah, they could, again, we'll meet that, sun goes down, they can do that 6 to 7 peak. A lot of things, again, it kind of looks like if you're also on the PGM. And so what is your minimums there? Things are getting built for 2 or 3, because that's the 5 to 8 PM or the 4 to 7 PM kind of peak windows where people need it. Having that extra hour, which adds extra cost, to make it from a 3 hour duration to 4 hour duration doesn't make sense then in some cases, because there won't be the demand for that extra hour. So, yeah, each project's a little bit different. It's we don't have the duration for all those.
Could I add a question in here? Because this is Colleen Leakin. I'm curious if FERC 2222, the order that is allowing behind the meter resources to participate in the wholesale market, is going to influence at all the direction of how BESS is developed in Virginia. So for example, would that open up revenues for behind the meter projects that would otherwise have not been possible? And do you see those trends starting to happen at all?
Sorry, this is the FERC ruling that on how the batteries are related to the capacity market, sorry, or are you talking about the interconnection?
No, this is 2222. It is distributed energy resources, participation in wholesale markets.
Right. I'm not specific into the weeds all that, my apologies, and maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that, but things that we're looking at though, that where we would have more market access, would accelerate basically the deployment of these resources, because we have other additional revenue sources to basically stack onto the projects. So we're not just limited to then certain types of services in Virginia and limited maybe to distribution, but also, again, we can play in those wholesale markets in PJM then, and you have more revenue basically coming in, and thus, we can build bigger and and more projects. There's more demand.
Thank you. And just to, maybe I should ask my question, but more generally, for the projects you're currently developing at the distribution level, do you feel like you have access to those revenue streams at the wholesale level? Or are there barriers to entry there?
Yeah, the majority of the projects that, without getting into too much company secrets, but I think we're always having an eye on them accessing the PGM wholesale market.
Okay. Thank you.
Chris, how does Virginia compare to other states that East Point is developing in terms of the ease of getting one of these projects online?
Well, it's interesting, I think that we're looking at projects up in the North New England area where discretionary permitting is basically impossible. And all the way down low to Texas where there is no discretionary permitting. So I think Virginia is pretty much in the middle. And as much kind of the state level policies that are in place and the ease of permitting basically at the local level vis-a-vis other states. I will say also it helps that we're in the PGM and while they're figuring things out in their interconnection queue, but that will also, once that I think gets solved and some of these FERC rules opened up a little bit better and these projects get treated better vis-a-vis other generation sources. We'll see that kind of regional, being able to play in those regional markets also helping our projects get developed in Virginia. I'll finally also just say, with offshore wind, more renewables that get built here, there's more demand and need for these things, and that those other kind of macro level renewable energy developments in Virginia, which are happening, is also very helpful. But those are not necessarily happening to different degrees in other states.
Chris, good morning. My name is Joanne Scott Webb. I'm a landowner and coming from that, not actual aspect is landowner. We have the Scott Solar and Powhatan. I have a question though. Do you find in Amelia County, one of our projects, they have now asked for 5,000 feet between battery storage. And so this becomes an issue because, this really eliminates many landowners to be able to apply to have 1,000 foot from a home and 5,000 foot from battery storage. Can you comment on that or give some suggestions or some comment on this issue? It comes back to education, of course, but when the county sets this, it becomes a real issue. It hurts a smaller project or a farmer that wants to do this or another timber owner. It becomes a real, not many land bases can actually qualify for those kind of projects.
Yeah, I think our experience is that it is the responsibility in the developers to, I think, educate not only the decision makers, but the neighbors and other members of the community and about the safety of these projects. But we're seeing this as a new technology, and so there's a lot of questions. If you Google it, usually a lot of things that you Google, you might find worst case scenarios. They get conflated with your battery for your electric bikes, etc., and those things. And there's not to say there hasn't been some fires recently in some of these projects, but the actual damage and/or negative impacts to the neighbors, how these systems are being designed now, have been significantly reduced and/or mitigated. So I think landowners and neighbors have valid concerns about some of these things, that they require 1,000 or 5,000 foot setbacks from property lines and/or buildings. We think is a bit excessive, and that there are other kind of safety mitigating items that can be put in place. It's pretty easy also to kind of do vegetative screening around these things, etc. And so getting folks comfortable and I think active outreach to those that are concerned, before the project is already maybe in the final stages of its permitting process are pretty important. And I think the good developers are trying to do that and usually find success with landowners and the discretionary permit deciders. if they can execute, I think, a pretty good landowner education program to put a lot of those concerns at ease.
I noted on,
Did I answer your question? Sorry.
so yes, but you noted on your other slides is the fact as far as the reaching out to the actual communities. That's a real, you put, look, your scale, your slide on looking ahead, or looking forward, your last note is about talking to the community. And I think that's a real important issue. In Amelia, we only have 13,000 people, so it's a very rural community, but that was the issue where we had with that, when that project I just mentioned, but I do think that is trying to communicate in these rural areas is very, very vital and critical. To get the education, to get the real understanding and comprehension about this.
I'll just say real quick on this too is, for those rural areas, we know there are people who appreciate their rural viewscapes, et cetera, and the benefit and these types of projects vis-a-vis the solar is we're usually doing these projects on 5-10 acres, maybe 20. Is actually site footprint. So they're very different scale vis-a-vis what you're seeing for the solar developments. And not to say that solar developments, I don't think do a good job in trying to mitigate all their impacts on the view sheds, et cetera. But that's another thing to kind of take into concern when thinking about these things. Thanks.
Any final questions for Chris? Chris, thank you so much for joining today. It's always great to see a Virginia-based company coming to present to the authority and sharing their perspectives. This was very helpful. We'll be able to include everything that you mentioned and this surrounding discussion in our annual report that we're working on later in this meeting. And we'll have to the governor and the General Assembly later this year. So thank you so much, Chris, for your time.
Appreciate your time. Good luck with the rest of your meeting. And Paul, I'll get back to you with some more articulate response regarding your questions on the interconnection. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Well, as discussed earlier, want to make sure we have as many folks here to participate in the discussion on the annual report as possible. So if Aaron, we could pause in the solar siting and solar for all letter, we will go ahead and dive into our annual report. Thank you, Ken, for putting this together. I think it did a very good job of summarizing our activities this year, sharing, pulling from the minutes of our various presentations and discussions that we've had. As a reminder for folks who may have missed emails or meetings in the past, I guess Secretary of Commerce and Trade, Energy Department has asked us to significantly pare down our report this year to 5 to 15 pages. They want the executive summary version. They want as much information packed into those 5 to 15 pages as possible. And that's why this report is going to look different this year. The big part we need to get to eventually is what recommendations we plan to make to those who will receive and read this report. But before we get there, is there anything that folks have to mention on to add, to subtract, to change on the overview of the authority and our activities over the past 9 or so months?
Those are which sections?
In the annual report, I think there's a hard copy.
Pages. Yeah, just which pages.
It's section A, page 3. While folks find these pages, want to gauge the interest in perhaps moving the history of the authority to the appendices. I don't think this would be a strong way to introduce the report. I think the folks that are reading it are going to know the history, but perhaps moving it to the appendices if they want to continue reading on, just to date back to 2017 and learn about how it's set up and the enabling legislation. Folks be amenable to doing that.
Absolutely. Explain that again.
So the section A-1, history of the authority. I think it'd be wise to move that to the end or mention it in an appendices. Perhaps toss in a brief introduction paragraph here, but I think it'd be stronger if we had an introduction and then went straight into the update on authority activities. Does that make sense?
I think so. You want to take that first section out?
And just move it to the end.
Yeah.
So are we on, that's page
Three.
3.
Yes.
Is there one?
And if you all want, please feel free to mark it up with track changes and send it back to me with whatever changes you want.
Sure.
That'll make it, I think, go a lot quicker today. 'Cause, I mean, I've got a few things, for example, on the next page related to the outcome of the hearing examiner's report and the few other details that are follow-ups relevant,
If you-
and publicly available information, but I'm happy to just send it to you as a document with those suggestions.
Sure, you can just mark it up and send it to me,
Okay.
that would be great.
And then will you just recirculate one that condenses?
Yes.
Comments back to this?
Yeah, so I think on a housekeeping topic, I would love to just discuss this, get into it, make some recommendations today. And for the next month or so, circulate a draft of this to the authority with the most up-to-date version. Take that up-to-date version, modify, make recommendations, make changes so that we have a widely circulated number of drafts. Then on a hopefully virtual meeting in the month of October, come together and approve this report
That'd
as
be really early October, if not this month.
it'll be early October then. But ultimately get the, vote to approve the report as written. So very happy to do a lot of this via email, but do want to take advantage of folks here today discussing this openly. Moving on, and everybody, please chime in and speak up if there are items to discuss and suggest in front of other authority members present. And I do want to make sure we mention the 3 companies that actually on section 2. I want to make sure we mention in the second paragraph, last paragraph of section 2, update on authority activities. There was a storage developer, of course, today, and then a solar siting discussion today as well. After that happens, don't want to discount what happened today. Then I think we could probably beef up the local permitting discussion. That was a long discussion with the executives of 3 different companies. I think a lot more was discussed. We can probably pull from the minutes there in terms of some of the specific examples that they've given in areas that they've developed and some of the other difficulties that folks are facing at the permitting level. So happy to circulate some additional language, but I don't feel like this paragraph totally encapsulated that wide ranging conversation in April.
Just keep in mind, I was working under the premise that we need to keep it short. so,
Yep.
But if you want to add some stuff to that, go ahead.
Take some examples.
Yeah.
This was the meeting where we had New Leaf, also did a presentation.
Correct. So that was not on local permitting, but I believe the interconnection issues.
That was under.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
If you get to mention the name, like the companies at least, that were, I might have missed it.
we haven't, and I completely agree. Is that all right with board members to mention who specifically?
Yeah, I purposely left that out, is just for anonymity's sake, but if you want to put it back in, it's your report.
I think it's public, I think it's a good idea.
Sounds good for this.
Yeah.
So that we had the 3 utility scale developers. Right. Then it was the coalition, the Virginia Distributed Solar Alliance that did the interconnection issues, correct?
Correct.
And then it
As
was,
well as the community solar. The second part of the inspection was interconnection of larger systems above 1 megawatt.
I see, the second interconnection discussion, and that was Nissan from New Leaf
Yeah.
Energy. Excellent. Catherine, any comments to raise now on additions for the interconnection?
I'll just send them to mostly just reflects, expand a little bit the hearing examiner's comments and some of the subsequent steps.
Okay.
We'll just add the same reason.
Um. Any other comments on what we've covered so far?
I was struck, so I know we're being solicited to do section C recommendations. I'm struck by, we were presenting what we did for the year. We haven't, I don't think, synthesized the commonalities of what the challenges are. We presented viewpoints from different providers and developers, et cetera. But we haven't intersected necessarily what are the commonalities and what would be the things that we want to target. So in the recommendations, we're gonna have to take from what is that synthesis of the commonalities, and then here's how we start blocking, tackling, and knocking these down, so that we're clear in what the measurable outcomes and recommendations will be, should the General Assembly and others, want to go for that. So I think we've still got, even the presenting discussions need to be synthesized to a commonality, and then we can do the recommendations based upon how we, I know it's a lot to do in 3 days, so.
Yeah,
Are we supposed to bring forward recommendations?
sorry.
By statute, are we supposed to bring forward recommendations? And what is the nature, what does the statute say? No.
Yeah, Aaron, do you have that handy? I can try to pull it.
Actions in here.
In the back, I think it might be in the
Appendix A, yes.
for those actually in the back.
On page 11.
On or before October 15 of each year, the authority shall submit an annual summary of its activities and recommendations to the governor, chairman of the House Committee on Appropriations in the Senate. So it's the only, report what we've done and then make recommendations. The only 2 things we're required to do in this report.
And again, in the past, the authority has not made any recommendations, so. And that's why I left that placeholder at the back, so if you all have recommendations, that's where it will go.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of where that's where the expertise is, right? That's, how do we move this forward? How do we meet the governor's goals? How do we identify what some of the barriers to those goals are going to be? And, the people with the checkbooks can figure out the prioritization on what they want to address.
Mhm.
If we don't make any recommendations, I don't think we're leveraging the expertise that's in the room.
So I hope folks have taken some time to think about the presentations and what the authority has done to date this year, and at least brainstormed some potential recommendations. We are not writing legislation or regulation. We're just saying what we recommend should happen, and let elected folks take that step forward to decide if action needs to be taken and what form and fashion it
So
should
I
be.
guess I have sort of the same question. So unless there's language that's not here, that's somewhere else. So we've got an obligation to submit a summary and recommendations, but that doesn't specify that they are legislative or public policy changes. Is that our understanding generally?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
And if you look at the Offshore Wind Authority's report, the recommendations that are in there are really recommendations for what the authority can do, not legislative type stuff. I'm not sure
So
how that
it's,
decision was
the
made.
other reports are, recommendations are, during the next year, we will solicit feedback on or discuss such and such topics or
Yeah, stuff
learn
like,
more about. It's more that than,
yeah, it's more internal recommendations, not what the General Assembly should be doing.
Then no change, from my perspective, these meetings and these presentations are for naught if we're not making recommendations for solid change in the future. It's hard.
And I think you
It is
can.
hard. It's very
but
hard.
I'm
That's
just
why it's
saying
not been done.
that group isn't.
Yeah.
and so what is the process based on the framework that's set up in the, I guess the charter of the group in terms of developing and approving those? Is it the simple majority? Is it concurrence of the board? What is the,
Pretty much concurrence. And they do vote to approve their annual report. This group has never voted to approve. It's been kind of consensus.
Yeah, so we're certainly looking for.
we're just trying to understand the process.
Yeah.
And going back a couple of years, you know, we selected Stratogen. Stratogen developed a report at the state of renewable energy storage within Virginia. There was a set of, you know, kind of the snapshot of as now, here's where we are. And then here's where regulatory national framework is. And then here are some general trends within the overall United States that are going to influence that. And then, of course, we had our own state legislation and the government mandates to move things forward. So now the question becomes, how do we leverage that educational piece and make sure that we're identifying clearly some of the roadblocks, as we just heard, to move things forward? Now, again, we don't have the authority to knock those down because we have no budget, but we certainly can say, if this is going to be a reality, here are some things that need to be addressed. And if you look back from my perspective, and maybe I have this wrong, Ken, and correct me if I do, I don't know of any other agency beside the SEC, and they're overburdened and overtaxed. Other than that, I don't know who can be bird dogging some of the big things that need to be addressed and need to be on people's agendas to make sure that we are aware of things. And if we deem that they are necessary to knock down, that we're actually focusing effort, time, resources to knock them down so that we can move forward as a state and meeting overall leadership objectives. I think that's our role here. And so I think the recommendations are, here's what the state needs to do in order to be successful, to meet the vision that has been established in leadership. I think we know what we need to do internally, and I don't think voting internally on what we're going to do next year is necessarily going to be productive. I mean, people have put us in these positions because they feel we know what we need to do. That's fait accompli. So now let's do what we think we need to do in order to advance the state. And maybe that's a little more outside the range of what we've done in the past, and okay. I'm for
I
that.
disagree with you.
Yep.
Again, it's up to you all. See what.
So what are the recommendations look like?
That's what we're here discussing.
Yeah.
I certainly have a few ideas to share. I think we can, in some areas, directly pull from what our presenters said. Talking about the grid enhancing technologies, made several concrete recommendations on having, I believe, the SCC, incentivize our utilities to look into these in order to avoid huge upgrade costs in areas where they might be well suited. I think our utility scale presentation, they asked for some more unanimity across counties. There's a beauty to each county doing something completely different from a neighboring county. But then there's absolutely no consistency from county to county. There's been a lot of discussion about whether the moratoriums and harsh restrictions that prevent any development of any size to come forward, if that's even constitutional, if it's legal. One concrete recommendation could be to ask the Attorney General's office to look into these moratoriums. Are they consistent with our current laws? Is a locality allowed to restrict a project's death on paper, and then that project not be at all feasible to come forward? I think some clarity there could help a lot of folks in counties to understand what their ordinances can and can't do. There's several more. Do you have any to add, Catherine?
Just curious to also hear the recommendations of the group.
What's the role of the authority in public education, especially at the local legislative level?
There is
Do
no.
We have
We
no,
have to go back to the legislation. on the authority, the purpose of the authority, there is nothing there. There's no. You see something, I don't see anything. I see it's that we collaborate in the report. What else? I don't see advocacy in. Are other citizen advisory boards advocating? That, to that degree?
I know VAUDA, the Offshore Wind Development Authority, isn't. They will submit letters of opinion letters, comments to BOEM and others, but they've submitted letters in the past to the SCC, but I wouldn't call it advocating. I don't know what the you're on that, right?
It's, yeah. Similar to what we described about. Not an advocacy. Not an advocacy of permitting. Or funding, frankly.
Where I was going with that question was, you know, if a county, uni, whatever, is adopting a 5,000-foot setback as an example, there's something, you know, there's something not necessarily conducive to the business climate. There's not something conducive to the problem that could potentially be addressing both for the municipality in context of peak shaving, savings, and all the stuff that for the ratepayers, their local ratepayers, let alone, you know, as a bigger portion. I don't know. The genesis of the question was, do we write a letter? Do we engage? Do we do anything on a proactive, or do we just use that as a data point that some munis, some municipalities, counties, whatever the case, are adopting ordinances that are going to, you know, say this is the way things are, and we remain silent on that except for noting that it's happened, right? And so it's not necessarily an advocacy, but there have to be a balance, and I don't want to. There's a reason that they're adopting that, and it's going to have a negative impact on those folks who want to engage in what the mission of you know, these policy objectives are. So there's got to be a rationale of where that comes together, and I don't know if that's our responsibility with the expertise we have here to say we'd like to talk more about this, or we don't think this is in the best interest of something, or we remain silent on that, and that's really where it's.
But if we don't have the authority, I don't know if we can do that. Possibly what we could do is to send out positive education to the local authorities. Put out a newsletter on a monthly basis, or as per our meeting, and figure out and let the local authorities know what is the right thing to do, or what are the and that would be basically educating people that do not know, because that 5,000-foot limit is just arbitrarily that somebody might have picked up. There's no science to it, I'm pretty sure.
I would say that in this case, particularly because I was involved with it, and Aaron, you were at some of those meetings, and I think that the situation where, you know, the developer, I think thought that was a have to happen, never gonna happen. Do you know what I'm saying? I think the developer, you know, it was we've had a year and a half, I guess, of hearings and so forth, a very hard process to get that to be the county to agree to this project. It's a piece of property that's almost isolated, you know, it has a prescriptive right of way, if anyone knows what that means, and it has, another part has, you know, it's a large project, but it's, I think the developer probably caved on that.
Sure.
And I'm not happy about that, because I think from a political standpoint, for the other landowners that would like to do this, I work for them, I want to argue for them, so I'm going to speak for them too. I'm going to speak for people that also want to do projects. Not always torn up one or two solar ordinances, had to have it, am I right about that? They've got through two and they've torn them up, you know. We have a project in there that's been talked about, you know, it's just some of the counties just take it. I think it comes back to educating the benefits, you know, what solar can do to help our communities, to move us forward. And certainly I also think we'll have fossil fuel, and we need to, you know, fossil fuels forever probably also, but I think solar is certainly a smart plan for us to move forward. But it's hard to get people in these rural areas. And that's where there's land that is, I speak for timber because I'm a timber puller. We have an oversupply of timber in the whole South. We have an oversupply. Our prices are where they were in the 80s. The prices are terrible. But I speak because I want to work. But I just think that the local counties training and some education. I think I don't know whether we could ever have meetings in local areas. They may be a ridiculous idea, but it came to my mind that, these rural areas have the people want to do this, but the boards, people complain and it doesn't happen.
So I guess I'm also mindful of what you said. I'm mindful that there's obligations that, for example, we have in the Virginia Clean Economy Act. Also mindful that in each locality and their representatives has to do what is best for their locality, and no two localities are exactly the same. So I'm mindful of the, I don't think we are in a position to recommend how a locality should, is 5,000 the right number, is 2,000 the right number, is 7 the right number? So I don't, sitting here making that recommendation, I would hesitate to support. However, if an observation that is included in the report is that there are differences by locality
Right.
that range from this to this, that there's not uniformity in certain standards or what's required for conditional use permits, that it varies widely. That to me seems like very fair and accurate observation,
Agreed.
and perhaps it serves as a conversation starter without going so far as to say they're not doing it right. Does that make sense? I'm trying to also strike a balance.
Yes,
And and a comment along those lines just could be that, you could even say something like, the more restrictive requirements, you don't have to say a locality to do it, but the more restrictive requirements reduce the amount of land that is available for fill in the blank. That just might be a way to balance, so I think that you're.
I was certainly the local government was always the best government. In this process, I didn't feel quite so positive about that position, but yes, that's a very excellent way of wording it, yes.
I mean, if it's steeped in safety, right? I think there are plenty of experts throughout the Commonwealth who can address safety and energy storage and things related to that. So that the education piece that you're talking about, if the rationale is because of safety, then the education focuses on safety. If the rationale is based upon, we just don't want it, the NIMBY, I don't want it in my backyard type thing, and I want it out of sight, out of mind. That's a local perception of which the elders, are making those determinations because that's what the people want. So I think that's hard to address.
I think you're right. When you go about 460 going to the beach or whatever, there's solar panels that have, they're right on the side of the road, there are houses around them. It's amazing. The differences in localities.
So maybe a suggestion, and that is that there's been some great and valuable information that's been gathered. The vast majority of the conversations that and the discussion we've had and the presenters have been developers. I would suggest that a recommendation for 2024's focus would also be to engage the diverse perspectives and engage the locality that has a 5,000 foot setback. Engage the localities and maybe have one meeting where either representatives of VML and VACO are present or representatives of individual localities are present that can speak to that, not putting them in the hot seat, but then maybe just talk through so we can better understand the rationale before we go so far as to make a recommendation. But I think those are important perspectives to hear from. So I would encourage us as part of 2024 to solicit feedback, not excluding the developer community, but outside the developer community in terms of those who are impacting where and how development occurs in the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so Catherine, our last meeting, we invited VACO to participate, invited them to participate this week, and cited the scheduling conflicts and not being able to speak openly about this until their annual meeting this fall. So we've invited them, and that's a huge priority for 2020.
Yeah, notice everybody knows we don't always schedule with a lot of notice, so. We just keep in mind that, I think the associations understand the needs of their members, but in order to be able to represent the needs of their members, they may also have a process they have to go through in order to be able to engage and get the okay in terms of whatever it is they might present. And it could be that we opt for a couple of individual localities who are willing to come, but part of that is also going to be giving them enough advance notice of when the meetings are going to occur and providing virtual option.
We do have meetings slated for the entire 2024 year on the books. And to your point, best county staff and supervisors to come and speak, and a said it would literally take an act of the board to allow them to come speak publicly on behalf of the county. So another difficulty that we've run into, but I totally agree with the point.
Hey, Scott, let me make a couple comments, and they're not necessarily responsive to any particular comments, but they just sort of go to the structure of the annual report and sort of the purpose of it. The idea of using the recommendations portion of the annual report to make recommendations about internal authority stuff makes no sense to me. Because we're reporting to people that couldn't give a crap about it. Like, the governor doesn't care who we're gonna call at our meeting next year, or what we're gonna focus on next year. That's not what a recommendation means. That's just internal stuff. You can schedule whatever you want, you invite whoever you want, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't make sense to make recommendations to the subject matter committee chairs and the administration unless they are policy recommendations. Otherwise, that language wouldn't be in the code. And there are tons of directives in the code, whether it's directing an authority, directing a commission, directing an agency to report back to a body. And it is always because they are tasked with evaluating an issue in a more robust way than the General Assembly can in a session, come up with some recommendations and report back those recommendations. Well, then what the General Assembly, the governor, et cetera, do with those is obviously totally up to them.
Yep.
I think the idea that that's not advocacy also doesn't make sense to me because the very filing of that recommendation is advocating for a position. Now, whether or not there's follow-up advocacy or not is a decision that and will be made on a case-by-case basis. But I mean, to me, if all we do is this group of people who's already kind of in the weeds of this industry listens to some experts throughout the course of a year and then tells the General Assembly, we've listened to some experts, but we're not making any suggestions, then frankly, I would vote to disband the authority.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense to me. There's no purpose to it. So now whether or not we can get consensus on recommendations is always the problem in a group decision-making process. And what the process for gaining consensus and all that is can obviously be tricky. But to me, if we're not making recommendations, then the report just becomes a box checking exercise, which just worked for Ken to do. It just goes into these or nobody ever talks about it again. Yeah. And you know, reports could be very specific and granular. Recommendations could be very specific and granular. They could also be very broad. Like, we've heard a lot about issues in getting approval at the local level for solar projects. We believe the General Assembly needs to take a closer look at the role localities play and the state plays in the approval of these projects. Like, we're recommending you to evaluate the issue. Or it could be, we've heard enough. Here's the answer. We think a bill should say the following. Like, that would be very specific.
Yeah.
In different authorities and groups and commissions and all sort of, like, if you're the code commission that I was on, you literally bring back legislation, you hand them bills and say, vote on this bill. There are other ones that are they just make recommendations or provide advice or act as subject matter experts, whatever. So, I mean, I would strongly favor literal recommendations back to the General Assembly, recommending policy positions. And it may be too late in the year to come up with, you know, to get that approved in the next few weeks. But to me, that's the whole point of what we did. Like, we should hear from utility scale solar presenters, localities, the utility. And at that time, we should receive that feedback and then we should take that information and develop recommendations at that time. So just like a General Assembly subcommittee would and making a recommendation to the full committee on a piece of legislation.
Very helpful. Thank you, Greg. So we've chatted about this for about half an hour now. Appreciate everybody's attention to the report. This, I'm gonna ask all authority members to spend some time over the next 3 weeks deliberating, thinking about these things, reading over old minutes and doing our best to come up with a number of different recommendations that we can bring to the authority at our virtual meeting and hopefully find some consensus or a majority vote on. Our plan is to distribute an updated copy of this annual report to folks on a weekly basis. Please shoot it back, reply all with some red lines, and Ken and Aaron and Paul, and we'll work with you guys closely to make sure we're getting this out
Yeah, you
a
can't.
few times. Excuse me?
You can't do send it to everyone. No more than two members can talk to each other at the same time in this FOIA. So everything needs to come from me, and then I would need to distribute it to everyone.
It's not just wait, the public meeting requirement, is that correct?
Yes.
Great. So if everybody will channel this through Ken, provide him a red line of everything that you are adding, and then Ken, can you work with me to provide a red line out to everybody and everybody see what different members recommended we add into an updated draft?
Yes.
Okay, it's going to require some attention from everybody over the next few weeks, but I think we can all be proud of us taking the step forward this year with an
Then
abbreviated
October
report.
15th is the drop dead, and the secretary's office needs to get it in advance to review it.
Yes.
So
I think we can all be proud of taking the step forward this year and fulfilling our duty as authority members to make recommendations to the folks that will be receiving this annual report. Aaron, would you kick us off with state comparisons of solar siting?
Sure, do you want to do that one first?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, I've got the speaker situation figured out. Let me make sure I get to it. All right. Not yet. All right, please, serial on Teams, but it's not showing here for whatever reason, so.
There you go.
Perfect.
That's
All right. So first I'll just start. Don't have a position on any of this. Just kind of did an overview of, what's going on in other states. I think just hearing this discussion of like, there are challenges working with local governments, and it's a conversation that's occurring nationally. Every state has something a little bit different. There is no secret sauce to this, and a lot of it is often reflective of the individual state. Are they a home rule state, a Dillon rule state, and everything in between. So I just spent some time just kind of giving a high level summary and overview of kind of what's going on in other states, and potentially some opportunities to kind of address some of this. U.S. Department of Energy actually compiled some of this information recently. They've got a website, just sort of addressing like what is the authority for siting in different states, and you'll see it's all over the place. And I actually had to email them and get them to change Virginia. They originally had us as yellow, and I felt like we were more of a dual, and that we have the local, and then the state comes in afterwards and permits. But it's very complicated, and there's a lot of nuance between each one of these, and I'll discuss it a little bit. And there's a couple of resources that you can take a look at if you're curious about just learning more about what other states do. One of them is Solar at Scale Guidebook that USDB funded. They had a couple of organizations. I just took a snapshot of some of them. This is just a compilation of what other states have. Who has the authority? Do they have any existing guidance, any review criteria? So you've got a lot where it's just the local government. You've got some where it's local government below a certain size and some siting board above a certain size. And then of course in Virginia, we have local government plus DEQ or local government plus the SEC. So that's just one resource. There's a kind of similar study from the University of Michigan, where they kind of took a similar look, slightly different methodology and how they classified it. But they also have kind of a table, you can go through it and look at, every state where they fall in terms of siting. So somewhat interesting. So I'll just kind of briefly touch on, what our process is in Virginia right now. Like I said, I think we can I would say we fit into the sort of dual permitting process in that, large scale solar facilities must be approved by the local government and then subsequently by the state government. So that local approval process, we've got the kind of a number of things that are included, the 2232 review of the comprehensive plan, zoning approval, and then in some cases a siting agreement. And then usually there's also approval of a decommissioning plan and a site plan. That's kind of the core of the local siting. And then we subsequently have a state approval process, two different options, permit by rule, which was created in 2009, with the purpose being to kind of exempt what they defined, the General Assembly defined as smaller renewable energy projects from the SEC process. So that was sort of the purpose of it. It certainly changed over time. Those regulations were developed between 2009 and 2012 and were finalized end of 2012. They were amended in 2017. They were attempted to be amended in 2019, but were never finalized. And then they're currently being revised, which I'll touch on at the end here, with regulations to be in place by the end of 2024. All of that is an exemption from the SEC CPCN process, which a solar project could opt to do that even if they're below 150 megawatts. But at the core of the PBR process was designed to exempt projects from the SEC process. It's very complicated in terms of what it looks like. UVA and Virginia Tech, I work with them quite a bit. This is a beta version, but they're actually working to map out what is the entire permitting process in Virginia. I just took a snapshot of it. Hopefully, they'll get this online soon. It's actually interactive, so you can click on it and get different options. But essentially, it kind of goes through, what size project, what options you have for permitting, what state permit applies. So it's kind of useful, and I think this will be a good resource just to help kind of clarify, how it works, especially for out-of-state developers who are not used to Virginia. And if you just kind of click in, this is like the second page, if you were to click on kind of the standard DEQ permit by rule pathway, and just kind of goes through like everything that's involved up from federal review process, interconnection process, locality review process, and what's involved in DEQ's process. I won't go into too much detail. I know UVA and Virginia Tech have been collaborating and working on this, and they've also asked for a fair amount of public comment from developers and folks that have been actually doing this just to make sure they got it right. So I just mentioned this will hopefully be a resource that will be out there, just to kind of help clarify what we currently do in Virginia. The other thing I'll mention is, and it was already addressed here, local policy is very different. And this is, I kind of inventoried back in December, what counties have some type of standards in place for solar. And of course, even of those that do have standards, those standards look very, very different. So just wanted to point that out as well. Like there's a pretty similar process through the state process in terms of how that looks, but at the local level, it's often very different. We have a fair amount of counties that still don't really have any specific standards in place. We have a lot that do have standards, and the standards are often quite different. So with that, I'll kind of touch on just a few other states and what they do. I think our neighboring states in North Carolina and Maryland are kind of good comparison points. Both of them actually at their core have the SEC, similar SEC, a CPCN process, but actually the CPCN process in both of those states look totally different from each other and from Virginia. In North Carolina, it's largely kind of locally controlled siting process. So the kind of standard local zoning approval process is how most projects are approved in North Carolina. The state's role is they do have a CPCN. It's less of an intensive application, more of a kind of registration process that would occur afterwards. But really is kind of less of a review. And they're also required to submit registration to sell the RECs. And of course, there's also kind of a mixture of how local governments in North Carolina have ordinances in place. And then North Carolina, I think another good point, both of these states have had recent legislation in 2023 to address some type of solar siting. In North Carolina, they just passed a decommissioning bill that standardizes decommissioning at the state level. So all decommissioning in North Carolina will go through DEQ. In Virginia, it currently all goes through the counties. So that was something they passed. They're updating the regulations and will be in place by 2025. But their state DEQ will manage all of the oversight of decommissioning. So there's kind of a growing role for the state in North Carolina. And then by comparison in Maryland, the state really has control over most siting, over everything really over 2 megawatts. So that's actually through also a CPCN process. And I think what's important there is the state Supreme Court in Maryland kind of affirmed state preemption of the CPCN process. So really this approval process kind of trumps any local zoning approval. Localities can participate in the CPCN approval process.
Maryland home rule with like preemption or?
I think they are. I don't remember exactly. So the way it works currently is like the locality can participate as a party to the decision. And the Public Service Commission can consider like the local comp plan and ordinances. And so that goes into this decision, but ultimately the state makes that decision. The locality still has rights to approve site plans and stormwater, but not actually zoning. And there was actually legislation that just passed a couple of months ago, where it kind of mandates localities to approve or deny their site plans and stormwater in a reasonable time. I think they're having issues where kind of localities were not taking action to try to delay the process. And they also said that localities couldn't condition the approval of one of these CPCNs through like conditional use or special exception permit. So they kind of affirmed that localities couldn't do conditional use permit or special exception permit, and really the state through their CPCN process. So 2 totally different approaches, and both states have a fair amount of solar development going on. And then just kind of looking a little bit broader in kind of other states, I sort of tried to classify, where are other states on this kind of continuum from local to state siting. You've of course got quite a bit of states that really don't have much state involvement at all, where the localities really kind of are the primary actor. Then you've got a couple of states, really not many. I think Virginia is pretty unique in that I would say that we're largely local decision making, but there is an additional state review process over top of that. But ultimately, kind of localities have a lot of sway in the decision making. So I would kind of put us not totally in the local, but local with some state oversight. You have some states where the localities are the decision makers, but the state has mandated what decisions they should do. So they basically said, you, the locality, have to approve a project if it meets these criteria. Ultimately, the localities still are the actors there, but the state has sort of told the localities what to do in a lot of situations. So it's kind of a little bit different. Then you have a lot of states where they sort of have this hybrid where there's a certain size, smaller projects would go through the local government, and then over a certain size would go through the state. Often have like a state siting board that would review them. Each state kind of has a different size. And then, like I said, you also have some states where really the state has kind of primary control over siting at all scales, mostly Maryland and New Jersey. There's certainly a lot of nuance and you could kind of classify in between each of these, but this is just kind of generally how I kind of classify them. In terms of kind of recent legislation that's occurred really just in the last couple of years, I mentioned Maryland and North Carolina's. Legislation in Illinois has gotten a lot of attention. I alluded to it. The state basically stepped in and required every locality to basically adopt the same ordinance of standardized conditions for projects, and basically mandated that if a project meets those standards, then the locality has to approve it. That one's gotten a lot of attention. Indiana did something similar, but they didn't mandate it. It was more of like an optional could choose to adopt the standards. A lot of other states have had legislation proposed.
That's just a question, not just like on Indiana, that I guess it was an option. How many localities adopted the option?
I'm not sure. I believe there was an incentive tied to it. To like, I think there was like they would had access to more of a certain tax revenue. I'm not sure how many did choose to do so. It is something I could take a look at. I was also saying a lot of states have had legislation proposed, failed, or is currently outstanding. And then in Virginia, I'll touch on really quickly. We had legislation last year that's still in the works in terms of how that's going to turn out. And a lot of you are probably aware of this. House Bill 206 is seeking to kind of update DEQ's permit by rule process. To consider more mitigation for certain significant adverse impacts of prime agricultural soils or contiguous forest lands. So kind of just a quick update on where that currently is at. There's an advisory panel, which I've been a part of, that's developing and finalizing those regulations for what mitigation will be required. That will have to be adopted by no later than the end of 2024. There was 5 meetings last year that kind of, I would say, were preliminary. It didn't get very far. And then there's an additional 5 meetings. There's been 3 so far to actually develop the regulations by the end of this year. And then these regulations will be open for public comment in 2024 before they're actually adopted. Some of the proposed regulations from the 2019 PBR update process that were never adopted are also being considered and potentially included in this update. I think at a high level, what we can expect is there will be some baseline mitigation required for these significant adverse impacts. They will likely be some type of offsite mitigation, so impacts to agricultural soils or forest lands will require some type of offsite conservation of similar lands elsewhere. That appears to be kind of the direction it's heading. And then some potential for incorporating some type of on-site mitigation as well, in terms of best practices in terms of vegetation and soil management. Happy to kind of take questions, but it's still kind of a dynamic process. But ultimately, I think it is kind of shifting a little bit. There's going to be more of a state role in how projects are developed in Virginia. So it is an important one and an important part of this discussion. Last thing I'll mention really quickly, there are some kind of opportunities to address this. One that I think our office is pretty excited about. USDOE just opened submissions for a grant opportunity yesterday. With the idea of kind of expanding the capacity and expertise of state and local governments around large-scale renewable energy siting and permitting. We've been in discussions with a number of our partners to apply for this. I think we're in a good position and something we really need. Up to $2 million to kind of build out a program to, just build more expertise around this. So happy to kind of engage with this body if there's any recommendations or if you can offer support. We're kind of in the beginning stages, but application will be due in early November. With that, I'll kind of pause if there's any kind of specific questions or comments. Happy to take them.
I'll ask a quick question. I know that we have this letter in front of us. That is not related. to
Unrelated,
that.
but I will get to that in a second.
Okay, no, and, you know, my follow-up was, is the application commission or this authority could write a recommendation for,
Absolutely. That's why I brought it up. Don't have anything tangible to say like, this is what we want to do because the application opened yesterday.
Mhm.
But I do think, you know, like support from this body would be great. We get to that point.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Aaron. Appreciate it.
Can you send a copy of the presentation out?
Yeah. All right, with that, I'll shift gears to another funding opportunity. Which I've got this in, I'll be very brief on that. What's that?
You pull that up, you're, that's fine.
Let's see here.
All right. It's, yeah.
I'm just gonna roll with it. So this is you have a letter, a draft letter, it's one with the letterhead on it. Which is for the Solar for All application that I will, that our office is currently working on, that's due in October. I'm not taking lead on it, my colleague Carrie is, she's actually out on vacation, so, she asked me to kind of share a little high-level overview and hopefully, get the authority's support on the application. Just a kind of a brief overview, it's a part of the Inflation Reduction Act that passed on the federal level back in August of last year. A component of this is the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. There's a number of objectives and kind of funding streams, and there's a lot of money involved. This is kind of the third component of it, which is the Solar for All application. In total, there's 7 billion distributed between at least 60 awards throughout different states. So our office is kind of leading up the application for Virginia. Really, the goal of it is to support bill savings for underserved communities, so low and moderate income. Clean Energy Advisory Board, which is our other authority or board. This is a little bit more specifically kind of in what they do. Our office already got a letter of support from that board last week. And that they work a little bit more specifically on low and moderate income solar. I think it's relevant to this authority more so, and it's just going to be a lot of money for developing and deploying solar in Virginia, and just being supportive of that in Virginia, I think is probably where the connection here is. Just in terms of the overall timeline, the application is going to be due in kind of a few weeks in the middle of October. So we're kind of in the process of collecting letters of support from various folks, and hopefully kind of start to get announcements and awards through next year. Just kind of an overview, like I said, all the funding is really for low and disadvantaged communities, mostly kind of for the residential serving, more distributed solar side. So we're not talking about utility scale solar. One of the requirements of the program is that there's 20% bill savings to any household that's served by this program. It has to be used within 5 years. These are kind of some metrics that our team has developed in terms of, you know, what we think is possible for deploying this funding in Virginia. So we think we can potentially get up to $250 million award in Virginia. And And potentially that could deploy, up to 200 megawatts of rooftop and community solar. And then just kind of some general estimates on economic impact of deploying that solar in terms of jobs. And I know my colleague Ryan is on the line if you all have any questions about kind of these metrics. He kind of worked to develop some of these and, what we might expect if we are successful. Just in terms of how we plan on using the funds, is really just like as a financial assistance tool for eligible technologies, to help offset costs. We're still kind of working through exactly how that would be used, whether it's through just a direct grant, a loan loss reserve, interest rate buy down, a lot of options. So still kind of finalizing how that will work in different scenarios. And then also developing technical assistance around just making sure that the market is able to support kind of this influx of funding. So just education and outreach, workforce development, kind of also just internal administration of the funds themselves. Technologies that are eligible for this funding, most of it will be residential solar, both single family as well as multifamily. Could include shared and community solar as well, that's serving residential customers. Energy storage is also a component for, included with solar at a residential scale, as well as any upgrades necessary to install solar, such as roof replacements or energy efficiency upgrades. Again, this is kind of just in red, the types of solar that we expect, will be stimulated by this funding. That's all I had. I know it kind of went through pretty quickly. So what you all have is kind of just a very high level letter of support. It looks essentially very similar to what we've asked some of our other partners, like the Clean Energy Advisory Board. I know we had DEQ also submit a letter of support and a number of others. So I'm not sure, Ken, I think the mechanics are actually to physically vote to approve it, or you're welcome to discussion. I'm not sure if we have a quorum still.
Now you've lost your quorum, so we just be a decision on, is there anyone opposed to the authority submitting the letter?
Yes, I have a question though.
Yeah,
One of the challenges for energy efficiency and solar for low-income housing is the rent versus own, renter versus owner. And so how will this project help make sure that the benefits accrue to the, low-income person living in the house, whether they rent or own, and not the landlord who owns a multifamily dwelling?
yeah, it's something that we've thought about a lot. And we've also been banging our heads a little bit with just the current policy framework in Virginia. In terms of doing PPAs and leasing, instead of ownership of the facilities, there's kind of limited capacity to do that in Virginia right now. So that's been a challenge. We're certainly seeking to include shared and community solar, as well as the multifamily shared solar program, and how funding into these existing programs that are really for renters specifically, that are really well positioned to take advantage of those programs. So that's been a big, especially in the multifamily space, recognizing that's there's a lot of LMI households in multifamily. And so we've been kind of strategizing around the multifamily shared solar program that does exist. I will caveat, it doesn't exist in the cooperative territories. It only exists in Dominion. So there are some challenges, and it's been a big focus in trying to address and find the right policy niche that works for those types of customers.
Thank you, Aaron. Appreciate you getting this draft together, and hope it helps the application. With the time we have left, I want to make sure we leave some time for public comment if anybody in the and on Microsoft Teams would like to chime in. But two more topics to run through, I believe, very briefly. as mentioned to Catherine earlier, we've tried to reach out to VACO representatives, and I still think that would be a very valuable perspective to hear in early 24. I'll re-up that. Similarly, reached out to representatives from the Data Center Coalition, talking about the off-taker side of a lot of this clean energy. And they had a travel conflict and were not able to present today, but are very interested in talking with us next year. Are there any other future topics folks want to raise that we can begin working on and schedule for?
I always thought having the SEC come in and talk to us about where they're seeing choke points would be always a very illuminating discussion. Because it's people process, their technologies to process stuff, the dollars they have to do it, and the time they have to do it. All of them contribute to long lead lengths and things. And just getting an understanding of their availability and where they're seeing choke points. It could be a connection process, it could be technology adoption, lack of clarity in governance, et cetera. And I think having that perspective, I don't know, having the SEC come in either on the policy side or a technology side or both and talk about each side would be useful. But I think that
Is that something you could spearhead?
I could.
Well, brings us to our next topic. Per the conversation we had at the last meeting, I've reached out to the clerk of the House of Delegates and his office, and they're very happy to welcome us back to the General Assembly building, as was the case during years past before my time. So
Into
they
which
have
building?
the General Assembly building,
Okay,
or the Pocahontas building. They have a brand new building that they are opening up either later this week or next, and have asked us to connect back with them in the month of October to schedule out some 2024 dates. So hope that will be convenient for members, and hopefully a draw to meet and keep quorums on a regular basis. But they have all the technology we would need to publicly stream these, and parking facilities, you name it. So very excited to have that opportunity.
and this will be the new building, not the Pocahontas.
They have all of them that are open to us, so we'll have to pick out a meeting room with them. I will go ahead and open the floor for any public comment. If the several folks online have anything to add for the authority at this time. Not hearing any, but appreciate everybody joining on and listening into the authority's activities. I would like to entertain a motion to adjourn at this point with the understanding that we're going to be working via email through our staff leads to draft up
You
some.
lost your quorum, you can't vote.
To adjourn?
Huh?
To adjourn?
Yeah, well, you got no quorum,
Oh,
you can't hold the vote, it's my understanding.
so stuck here.
I believe you can still motion to.
Huh?
You can still motion to adjourn the meeting, just.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanne. I would like to flag for folks, I would like to hold a virtual meeting on Wednesday, October 4th, once we've had 3 weeks to work on this. It still gives us 11 days to finalize this report following, but we need that final draft on October 4th. So if folks would block that off on their calendars at this point, we will circulate a agenda and a Teams link to join. So thank you.
That's for a virtual meeting,
Yes,
and what day of the week is that?
that's a Wednesday.
And if you're here at the library, go out in the parking lot. They've got a whole area of the parking lot, cornered off with all the solar panels that they're about to put on the roof.
Cool.
You can see all the equipment.
Like,
Well,
Thanks for coming down. Of course.